So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Erica Hernandez. She has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Arizona in Plant Science, MS in Horticulture Biology from Cornell University. She currently attends Portland State University and is pursuing a PhD in biology with a focus in plant microbe interactions. And so I welcome her today to speak to us. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Matt. All right, guys. So today I'm going to talk to you about pest control and plant health for home gardeners, because I hear there's a lot of home gardeners in this group. And sometimes when you're looking up information online, it's really hard to kind of, trudge through everything that you might be seeing, whether it's for commercial gardeners, whether it's for a single potted plant, whether it's for all different types of plants that you could be using. There's a lot of information out there. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a framework on how to think about pest control in your home garden and some concrete ideas and strategies that you can use today if you wanted to go home and do some of these things. All right, so let's get going. So my agenda, who am I? What is IPM? And then we're going to go over each of the categories of activities within IPM and some additional resources for you guys to review outside of this if you want. This presentation is being recorded and I'm making the PowerPoint slides available to you guys so that you can look over them whenever you want. All right, so who am I? Matt did a great job, covered the basics. I've got a Bachelor of Science in Plant Science, a Master's of Science in Horticultural Biology, and I'm currently a first-year PhD student in the Ballhorn Lab at Portland State University. What he didn't say is I used to work for Griffin Greenhouse Supplies, which did have a large warehouse not too far away from here, and used to, I don't know if they still continue to supply you guys with some of your greenhouse supplies. So I worked for them for 3.5 years, traveling around the country. This was just a domestic American company, helping people grow a lot of weed. That's mostly what I focused on. But interestingly enough, people who are growing cannabis have a lot of overlap with people who are growing organic gardens, because there's such tight regulation on what's going on with cannabis that oftentimes they can't do anything involving pesticides at all. Or if they do, they're very specific pesticides. So they really have to rely on more environmentally friendly and organic production. So I spent several years really immersed in these techniques. So we'll talk about a lot of that with you today. Okay, so to start this off, what is IPM? How many of you have heard this term before, IPM? All right, great. Looks like there's some familiarity here. And there should be. This is a very important concept in organic production and even just any kind of production, commercial horticulture, big agriculture. Integrated pest management is a process based on an ecosystem-wide strategy collection. So this is just a way to think about pest control. And the main thing that we want to think about here is that with IPM, we are aiming to minimize the risk to human health, the risk to beneficial organisms, and the risk to environment. So people who follow an integrated pest management strategy or planning system tend to use less drastic measures, have less of an impact on their environment, and it's just a holistic way to approach gardening. So what's involved in that? With IPM, we typically think about this as a pyramid with our most important structures and strategies at the bottom. So we've got our prevention at the bottom. Everything should start with prevention. And then our least desired strategies at the top, which are going to be our chemicals. So we always want to start at the bottom and climb up, starting with prevention, then moving to cultural and sanitation, looking at physical and mechanical, then biological, and then finally chemical if everything else has failed. So let's go through each one of those. Prevention. So if you were to do one thing in your garden that's going to have a huge impact, it would be start anything out of this category. Because anything that you do before you ever start putting plants in, before you ever have any pest problems, prevention strategies are going to help you keep things lower all throughout the season and keep you ahead of any of those big outbreaks of insects or diseases. So this is the most important part. And it should start before you ever put anything in the ground, which might be too late for some of you this year, but maybe not. So one thing that you can do before you start even putting things in the ground is thinking about crop selection. And there's three big categories that we want to think about when we're choosing our plants for our garden. There are plants that could be considered climate resistant, which has been more important in recent years, and especially plants that are drought resistant is going to be very important. And many local nurseries have information on crops that are drought resistant at this time. There's also disease resistant plants, which if you didn't know, breeders have been breeding for lots of different types of qualities in many common garden plants. And one of these is finding disease resistant plants, especially in things like tomato and a lot of melons here in Oregon. We have pretty strong breeding programs where we end up with varieties that are resistant to specific common pests or diseases. In this case, tomato, the variety I've chosen to show here, Legend Tomato, is resistant to late blight. That's a common problem with tomatoes. And if you grow this variety, you're less likely to see this in your garden. Again, this is something that as you go to garden centers, they have information on, oh yes, we have some varieties that are resistant to various things. And then finally, insect resistant plants. This is a bit more difficult and not as common, but can be a very important category, especially with things like Japanese beetle and lacebug, azalea lacebug. Those are two pretty big pests in our region. And there are some crop varieties that have shown resistance, or that the bugs just don't seem to have a preference for those varieties. And again, this would be something that would be labeled in the garden center when you buy it, or you can also purchase seeds for various things. You wouldn't be purchasing azalea seeds, but you would find seedlings and small shrubs at the garden center. Oh, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask at any time, or we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. All right, so now at this point, say you've got plants in the ground and you want to start making sure you keep ahead of any invaders that are coming into your garden so that you know what's going on. One of the things you can do regularly is performing beet tests. Now, this is part of a general scouting program, and scouting is the process of physically looking over your plants to see if there's any problems going on. So beet test is a really useful tool because it can help you find those insects or debris that might be in your plants that you're having a hard time spotting just by looking at them one way or another. So the beet test is typically used for checking for crawling insects and mites. And to do this, it's really simple. You don't really need that much. You need a piece of white paper. I highly recommend a clipboard or at least a piece of cardboard behind that paper to keep it flat. You need to get your plant that you want to test, and optionally a hand lens. You can do this without a hand lens, but it does help. So as you can see, this lady here, she's got her clipboard with her white paper and she's kind of tucked it into the canopy. And what you do when you go in there is you just gently start tapping the foliage on top of or above the paper. And anything that's kind of loose on that foliage is going to fall right down onto the paper. Now, the reason why you don't necessarily need a hand lens is that once you take that paper out, you can look for movement. And sometimes you'll be able to identify these insects that are crawling around, or mites that are crawling around on the paper without a hand lens. And just notice that yes, there are some insects that have fallen off. But if you have a hand lens, which I have a bunch of examples up here for you guys to look at later, and here is an example right here. This is a hand lens. If you have a hand lens, it makes it a lot easier to identify those very small insects that you might not be able to see details clearly. And we'll go over some of these common insects soon. So really what you're getting out of this beat test is isolating those insects or mites from the foliage where they might be hiding in the nooks and crannies and making it really hard to find them on the plant. This is a really important one that I would suggest doing at least every couple weeks to see, you know, what's going on in there. What can I find? And here's our hand lenses and microscope usage. Now, not everybody's going to be able to have access to a microscope. I know that. But hand lenses are fairly common and they are fairly cost effective. And importantly, some pests and your biological control agents cannot be viewed with the naked eye, at least not clearly. Specifically, if you've got nematodes, which are typically found in the soil, if you have certain species of mites, these can be very difficult to see with the naked eye. Even if you do the beat test and you see that something has fallen off and landed on the paper, it might not be clear if that's debris or a mite. And again, some pests are difficult to tell apart without that magnification. So winged aphids and fungus gnats is a great example. Typically with your hand lenses, it's going to be about 10x magnification. So everything looking through this will be 10 times larger. Sometimes you can get 20 to 40x hand lens options, but beyond that, we're looking at microscope territory. 40x to 100x are usually going to be these stereoscopes or dissecting scopes. And then today I've brought the Dynolite digital microscope, which has a 20x to 250x magnification that you guys will be able to take a look at as well. All right, another card that is, or another tool that is great to use, but is often misused are sticky cards. Sticky cards are not a control strategy. They are a monitoring strategy. So what is this? A sticky card is basically, that's what it looks like. It's this card with these typically labeled little grid patterns, and it's covered in glue. And I mean, it's just what it sounds like. It's covered in a sticky substance that if your pest hits it, they're stuck, they're not going anywhere. And these are great for catching things like winged insects, thrips, whitefly, aphid, fungus gnat, shorefly. They also catch some beneficial insects as well. These are not, these don't have any discretion. They'll just catch whatever sticks to them. So the way I often see people use these is as a control strategy. They'll put them out, they leave them out for weeks, months at a time until they get absolutely covered with whatever they're catching. And then they finally change them. And really all this does is let you know what is flying around. It does not catch things at a rate that controls your pests. The best way to use these is to change them weekly or have one out for a week, a month, just to get a sampling of what's going on in your garden. And also placing them somewhere where you're going to catch things that are relevant to your crop. You want to place these typically near the top of your crop, the top of the canopy. So you're catching the insects that are flying just above the top and around as they move from plant to plant. And then if you're monitoring for things like fungus gnats or jumping insects near the ground, you can also place these horizontally to catch things as they jump up off the surface of the soil. Yellow is a pretty typical color for these to be. They're a general attractant. It mimics the color of many flowers that many insects are attracted to. But you'll also see them in colors like blue, which can be specific to thrips, but either a blue or a yellow sticky card will generally catch what's flying into them if you place them in appropriate places. One thing you don't want to do is place it totally inside the canopy, so underneath all the leaves, because then you're just going to get it stuck to your plants. And you'll be catching plant material and not insect material. All right, so when you are checking and performing your scouting on a weekly or daily basis, if you like to go out into your garden every day, things that you might want to check are going to be looking at your plant foliage. Select plants at random throughout the crop, or if you only have a couple plants, check them all. Look at, are you seeing any signs of damage? Are you seeing any insects or mites physically around? Whenever you get new plants, either from the garden center or from your friends, you want to check those. That is one of the biggest ways insects can get into your garden, from somebody else's neighborhood, from the farm miles away. You definitely want to check all of those incoming plants. If you're indoors, you want to check plants near air exchanges and doorways or ingress or egress, because insects love to come inside from outside. It's nice and warm inside, and they are going to try and get in there. So oftentimes, if you're indoors, the first place you'll see pests are near windows, near doors, near places where people are walking a lot, because we are also vectors for these insects. And then again, your weekly sticky card checks, if this is something you're doing. This is a pretty typical appearance of, unfortunately, a heavy thrips infestation with some aphids thrown in as well. But this is what we are wanting to see. Our sticky cards are working to help us monitor. If you are waiting until the card is completely full, you're basically losing data, because you don't know when those insects appeared on the card at that point. All right, so another key part of prevention is knowing your enemy. So I'm going to talk about some of our most common insect and mite pests. And this isn't an exhaustive list, there's a lot. So I've got some extra materials for you guys to look at if you want to know more about different pests as well at the end. So first off, thrips. I'm sure you've probably seen these if you've gone into the greenhouse at any point, or even just looked at plants around you. You might have seen the damage and not known exactly what you were looking at, because these guys are small. They are typically 1 millimeter or less. There's a lot of different varieties, but often what we see are Western flower thrips, which is also called this. I hate pronouncing those Latin names, but that is the F. occidentalis. And these guys have an interesting life cycle in that part of their life cycle happens in the foliage, and part of it happens in the soil or the growing media. And where they're actually laying their eggs is in the foliar part of their life cycle. So some signs that you'll typically see with thrips are going to be leaf stippling and young leaf distortion. The distortion often looks like this because your thrips are going to be hiding at the growing points or underneath leaves or in flowers, and they will feed on that young tissue. And as that tissue grows, that damage magnifies. And what do I mean by leaf stippling? I'm going to show you a very nice example in a minute, because there is another pest that also produces stippling in our plants, and that's going to be our spider mites, our two-spotted spider mites, so called because they've got these little spots on them when they are adult. And typically, this is when they are an adult in their active phase. Spider mites also go through dipause, which leads to a color change and a bit less activity level, which can be a seasonal change. And again, these guys are also very small, under 1 millimeter. You can see these with the naked eye, but you cannot see details. So this is one of the signs that spider mites are present, is they will actually produce visible webbing. And within that webbing, you see all these little dots. These are spider mites and their eggs in there. And if you're looking at them, they will be moving around, but it's very difficult to see detail without the aid of a hand lens or maybe a microscope. And they also leave some pretty significant leaf stippling. Where do you find these guys? These are typically on the undersides of leaves or in stem elbows, like I've shown here. So stippling, what is this? I have this really good example from a cannabis farm of spider mite versus thrips stippling. So stippling is basically kind of like a dotty pattern. And the two patterns produced between the two are very distinct. So this one here, you can see it looks like it's sort of been covered with these little white dots kind of evenly throughout the leaf. This is very characteristic spider mite stippling, because what's happening, they have piercing sucking mouth parts, and they kind of pierce into leaf cells and suck up all those leaf juices and leave behind damaged or emptied cells here. And that's what we're actually seeing with this stippling. Whereas on the right-hand side here, you can see that you still see these spots, but they look very different. They're clustered into small clusters, and there's a couple different groups of them. This is very characteristic thrips stippling, where they'll also sort of leave behind kind of a silvery sheen. And sometimes you'll even see little tiny black dots, which are often not visible without the aid of a hand lens. And that is actually frass or thrips poop that they're leaving behind at the site of their feeding. So if you look at these two, these are very different in appearance, and they're very characteristic of, one, the spider mites, and two, the thrips. So you don't even need to see the insect or mite at this point. You would look at this and know, oh, I know what's going on here. This is thrips or spider mites. All right, so next up, we've got foliar aphids, which I think we're coming up on a time where we're going to start to see a lot of aphids showing up in the greenhouse and in your gardens. As soon as those temperatures start to rise, they start to multiply. So there's a lot of different aphid species out there, but they're all in the order Hemiptera. There's many, many of them. And honestly, I would not bother identifying what species of aphid you have, because most of your control strategies are not going to depend on what species of aphid you have. But if you can identify that, yes, it is an aphid, and yes, I know what crop it's on, then you're ahead of the game there. The thing about aphids that make them so difficult is you may have heard that they're born pregnant. This is true. And a single aphid female can give birth to as many as 12 offspring per day. If you find an aphid colony and just kind of watch it for a while, you will find an aphid that's actively giving birth, probably more than one. So if you think you have aphids, these guys, you can spot them with the naked eye fairly well. Some of them are pretty tiny. They go through multiple life stages that all look pretty much identical except for size. But if you look at aphids, what is very characteristic of aphids might be a little bit difficult to see, but they've got these kind of round bodies. They've got these antennae, but they all, no matter the species, they all have these little cornicles on the end. And I've always described them as kind of like butt horns, because that's what they are. They're like these two little exhaust shafts coming out their butt end, pointing away. And part of the identification process is looking at those angles and lengths and colors, but they all have them. So finding those cornicles is very characteristic of aphids. And if you're looking at the colony as a whole, seeing cast skins. So this is basically just a bunch of white discarded skins as they move through their nymph stages to adult. They leave a lot of these. And then honeydew, which basically what's happening is they are, again, piercing sucking feeders, and they are feeding so much that they typically just start pooping out sugar water consistently. And this is part of the reason why these are such a pain to deal with. Because of that sugar water production, aphids are also actively farmed by ants. So if you didn't have aphids, but you have ants, keep a lookout for where those ants are going, because they might be bringing aphids in at some point. Or alternatively, if you had aphids and you keep treating them and they keep coming back and you can't figure out why, see if you've got ants crawling around somewhere, because they might be evading your control process. So where are these guys found? They're found on the undersides of leaves. They also like tender new growth and, any new stems that's going on the plant. All right, fungus gnats. Everybody's dealt with these if you've had a house plant at some point or another. And there's various species or various families in the order Diptera. These guys are more of a nuisance than anything, unless you've got, a lot of really wet seedling production. The larva is really where we run into problems, where the larva can chew up young plant roots, and they can also carry fungi. Signs, you'll see poor seedling health in adults on sticky cards, which look like this. They are visible to the naked eye. I'm sure you've seen a fungus gnat at some point or another. Very annoying. And they can get out of control very quickly, but they're also not super difficult to deal with and don't cause a lot of damage. They're primarily found on the top 1.5 to 2 inches of media as larvae, so they don't go deeper than that. And as adults, they're not great flyers, so they kind of just like hop around and they'll fly a bit from plant to plant, but these guys are not long distance flyers. And then the scourge of an outdoor gardener, slugs and snails. Everybody has these in Oregon. Everyone hates them. For us, our most common species is the gray field slug, which is right here. But again, just like with aphids, it really doesn't matter what species you have. Your control strategies are all going to be pretty similar. And also your impacts are probably going to be pretty similar from these guys. These like to snack on tender new growth, and they're mostly a nuisance for young seedlings and leafy greens. Once your plants get larger, they don't tend to harm them as much. If you start with larger plants, probably not going to be an issue. But if you're starting from seeds or young starts, you got to watch out for these guys. Signs, slime trails, holes in leaves, and piles of frass. These leave behind really gross snail poop everywhere, especially when they're eating well on your seedlings. And then typically you'll find them underneath pots in the top layer of soil as either eggs or juveniles, and on the underside of moist boards. All right, and worms and caterpillars. There's a lot of economically important worms and caterpillars in Oregon, so I couldn't include all of these. And some of them, you'll notice, this is a beetle larva. It does look like a caterpillar or a worm, but this it says right there, not a caterpillar. But they do cause similar issues for many crops. Oftentimes, these are going to be species in Lepidoptera, in the order Lepidoptera, and the size and the coloration can vary widely, but signs are often very similar. Holes in leaves, these are going to be more up in the canopy rather than close to the ground with our slugs and snails. Frass on the leaves, again, pooping where they're eating. And cut stems, especially with our cutworms. I dealt with this last year in my garden when I was growing peas. They would just chop them down right about 6 inches above the ground. It was so frustrating. And then where you find them, sometimes they're hiding on the underside of leaves or against tree bark. With cutworms, I believe those guys descend to the soil during the day and come up during the night to cut down all your plants. So it depends on what species. Figuring out what you have isn't always as important with these guys because your control strategies are going to be fairly similar, except for the cutworm. You might want to know if you have those, and you can go out in the night and catch them. But for these guys, sometimes we don't want to control caterpillars because we have a lot of threatened butterfly species that also have caterpillars that are not great for our crops, but can be specific to a certain plant. For example, milkweed. We know that, I believe it's monarch butterflies that love milkweed. And in that case, we're growing the milkweed so that they can eat it and enjoy it, lay their eggs there. And that's our desired outcome. So you may want to know what you're getting before you go out and squash them or apply any of our control strategies. And then diseases. There's a lot of diseases out here, so I just wanted to mention the basic categories that you might be looking at. For plant diseases, we're often looking at fungal, bacterial, or viral sources. And I've got a couple of examples, but oftentimes we can deal with diseases through prevention and cultural adjustments, which we're going to talk about. So things like powdery mildew, this would be a fungal disease that often crops up a lot because we have a very humid environment here. And we'll see a lot of powdery mildew sort of later in the season. Leaf spots can be bacterial or fungal and oftentimes arise from getting water splashed on leaves during watering, or if we splash soil up as well, that can lead to leaf spots. Fire blight is often an orchard issue or a landscape tree issue. This is actually caused by a bacterial infection that is handled at the city, municipal level, orchard level. It's not something that home gardeners can really do, but you will notice it. Once you learn what fire blight is, you start to see it happening because it's pretty prevalent in our environment. And then for viruses, there's a lot, but oftentimes what we see are interesting appearances like mosaicism. This is a rose mosaic virus, where the productivity of the plant is often impacted, but it may not affect the plant health too severely. In some cases, viruses are desirable. In fact, the tulip breaking virus is actually what led to people becoming so interested in various appearances of tulips way back in the day, and that's what led to tulip mania. So sometimes viruses are great. We don't always want to, villainize them or vilify. All right, so getting to cultural and sanitation practices, that was probably our biggest chunk of stuff. I know that was a lot. But cultural and sanitation practices. So I've talked a lot about, what our enemies are, but how do we combat them? So starting off, keeping your plant healthy and keeping its environment stable is part of prevention. And we do that with our cultural practices, starting with good watering practices. There's some concrete tips for you. And it's really easy to say these things. It's harder to do in practice, and I get it. So don't overwater. Of course you don't overwater, but why not? So pooling water can lead to algae and disease spread. And oftentimes if we see areas of pooling water, we know that there could be some diseases that are either making their way through that pool of water from plant to plant, or we might be affecting the condition of the root zone by denying the roots oxygen, because roots still need oxygen, just like the rest of the plant. You could be drowning your plants, which is very possible to do. But then, on the other hand, don't underwater. This can lead to wilting and stressed plants. It's a fine balance. And the reason why I can't get any more specific with that is because these watering practices will be different for each garden, for each plant that you're growing. So you have to, through practice and active noticing and learning in your garden, you have to decide what is going to be the best watering schedule for your plants, for your garden, for your microclimate. Typical signs that you might be underwatering, of course, you'll start to see wilting. And at that point, we've let it go pretty far if something is wilting. But just because a plant is wilting does not mean it's dead, right? We know that there's different degrees of wilting. We might see just a tiny bit on the very growing tips, a very new material. That's where it starts, and it moves downward through the plant. So the newest material wilts first through to the oldest material. And seeing where that wilting is happening helps you judge how severe this wilting has occurred. And then the last two, these are easier to implement. We always want to water at the base of our plant to avoid wet foliage for a number of reasons. I mentioned those leaf spots. If you're noticing that you have leaf spots in your garden, make sure that as you're watering, you are watering underneath the foliage and you're not splashing soil up or splashing water up. We also want to water deeply and less frequently to encourage deeper root growth, which will also encourage our plants to be a bit more drought resistant as they have a deeper root system to draw water from. So how do we do these things? I worked in a commercial nursery for a little while. One test that we would implement a lot was the pot weight test for containers. And again, this isn't something that has a concrete value for it. But as you go, if you're growing in containers, not everybody is. If you're growing in containers, you pick up the pot and you feel how heavy it is. And over time, you get a feel for what's dry and what's wet. And you water before it gets too completely dry, but you don't water when it's still pretty heavy and pretty wet. You can use your fingers to test for the wetness of the soil. Is the top 1 inch fairly dry, or is it still pretty moist? That's a pretty good indicator of whether you need to water or not. Every time you water, take note. Look at your soil, look at your plant. Does it look dry? Does it look like it might start to wilt? You'll start to get a feel for when is something about to start wilting. And then always take note of areas where water tends to pool in your garden. And this will be different everywhere. Those are important to notice because we don't want to plant things in those pooling water areas. All right, good feeding practices. Our top feeding tips: don't over fertilize. Certain pests, especially aphids, are attracted to overfed foliage or over nitrogen rich foliage. And then choosing a fertilizer form that fits your style. There's 3 main fertilizer forms that you can use as a home gardener that I would recommend you stick to the top 2 because they're a little bit easier to control, but everybody has a different workflow plan for their garden. So we've got our top dress slow release fertilizers. This is really great to use because it's kind of, once you dose it out and put it on the plant, you just check periodically to see if it's completely broken down, or you go by the recommendations on the bag for how often you apply this, and you don't have to feed at every watering event. And oftentimes this leads to, a very nice supply of nutrition throughout your growing season, which is one of the things about this that makes it great is anything that you can do to reduce your number of activities that you need to do, oftentimes will reduce the chances that something will go wrong or you'll forget something. So this can be a great choice for somebody who has less time day to day. Water soluble fertilizers, oftentimes these are not organic, but you can find a lot of slow release fertilizers that are organic approved. But water soluble fertilizers are great options if you need to adjust a short-term nutrient deficiency, or if you have a sick plant and you want to fine-tune your fertilizer control. Water soluble fertilizers are a great option. And then soil amendments are often made at the beginning of a growing season before you plant, adding things to your soil, either in the ground, in your containers, in your raised beds. And they might require a bit more effort initially, but then you don't do anything throughout the season. So they might require things like something to dig them in, something to dig rows. And that can be difficult to deal with. You may not have the physical capability or the time or the equipment to do that, but they are very much a set it and forget it choice. And then noticing patterns of yellow foliage to diagnose deficiencies. So as you're performing your scouting duties, you look at your plants, you're noticing your insects that are coming in, you're noticing your diseases, but also notice, where are leaves dying or dropping off of my plant? Where is the quality of the green changing? Is it going from the top down? Is it going from the bottom up? Are there no changes in yellowing or greening or browning? These are things that you'll want to notice to help determine if you are practicing good feeding. All right, and then good sanitation practices. With our sanitation practices, we are helping to combat the buildup of algae, and we're helping to limit the spread of disease. So there's two main areas that you want to focus on with sanitation. You want to look at your tools and you want to look at the ground. So cleaning tools, clippers, watering cans, and hoses, these are things that can spread diseases around. For clippers, dirty clippers can spread diseases, especially if it's a bacterial disease or a fungal inoculum. As you're clipping plants, you might be spreading that inoculum from plant to plant. Watering cans can often hold algae and debris, so make sure you're checking those. And then hoses, you'll also drag stuff around if they're on the ground a lot. And that's something you just want to keep an eye out for. For walkways, our big thing is that algae on walkways is dangerous. If you have a leaking hose, or if you have some of those pooling water areas and they're always staying wet, you're going to develop algae in those areas. And that's a slip risk for anyone who comes into range of your garden. And also, algae on walkways will support insect pests. You'll see things like shore flies that will feed on and breed in your little algae patches. And those, again, they're not going to really hurt your plants, but they're a big nuisance. So when we're thinking about this, we always want to clean before sanitizing. And to do this, we want to start with cleaning, we soap and scrub to get rid of dirt and debris. And soaping and scrubbing is not sanitizing. Sanitizing is using a sanitizing agent such as bleach. So we would do something like a bleach water dip for our clippers, for example, to kill algae or any disease inoculum. And then we always want to make sure we're rinsing that bleach off away from our plants so that that bleach residue doesn't get into our containers, into our garden soil, anything like that. All right, physical and mechanical. What are these strategies? So oftentimes we're talking about physical and mechanical strategies. Physical are going to be things like physical barriers. And this can be something like moving your plants from outside into a greenhouse if you wanted to grow indoors. But oftentimes if you're staying outside, you're adding physical barriers like things like a row cover. And these are fairly simple. They're often used with just this very fine netting over plastic frames here, like PVC pipes. And the idea behind this is to exclude any flying insects from coming in and laying eggs. For example, if you've got a moth and a worm problem, like the cabbage leaper, the moth will come in and it'll lay eggs on top of your greens, and you won't know. These eggs are very tiny. And then the eggs will hatch, and suddenly, out of nowhere, you've got these little worms eating through all of your greens. But if you start off the season with a row cover like this, it has multiple benefits. One, it's keeping out those flying vectors from coming in and laying eggs on your plants. And two, sometimes, you can use these as a bit of insulation on cold nights, like tonight is going to be very cold. If you've got plants, bring them in. Then things like garden cloches, if that's how you say that word. I've only ever read that word, honestly, and I've never used one of these, but I see these very frequently at garden centers. And you can actually make these as well, pretty easily. If you have gallon jugs of anything, I've seen people cut off the bottom of gallon jugs and just put them right over the top of your plants. And this is a similar idea to the row cover in that we're excluding our flying insects from coming in and feeding on our plants. We're also excluding things like rabbits and mice, unless they decide to dig under it. But oftentimes this is enough to discourage most animals from getting in there, and also birds. And the plastic is a bit more insulating than the cloth cover. So this would do better in a frost scenario than the row cover. It's also great for a smaller number of plants and good for things that are pretty low growing, like this lettuce. You wouldn't see this being used for like the chard that's in back here. It's a little too tall. You might want to go with a row cover for something like that. If you're dealing with birds or squirrels, there's also bird and animal netting. And then if you're dealing with rabbits, like I am, raised beds and raising things off the ground, just physically getting them away from wherever that issue is living and traveling, can be a good option as well. So physical barriers, be it height or cloth or plastic, would be an option here. And then utilizing trap plants. This, I would consider this a physical consideration or strategy, because these are something that both tells us information and we can physically remove them when we see that they've been affected. So what are trap plants? Trap crops are sacrificial plants that are more attractive or susceptible to pests than your main crops. So you're putting these in your garden with the intent that they will be affected by some sort of pest. And that gives us two big pieces of information. One, it tells us when that pest arrived in your garden, like right at the beginning, because this is the first thing that they will go for. And two, it tells us what their population levels are. And there's a couple of really good tools for you to use. Most of these are very cheap and easy to get. For example, marigolds, these are favored by thrips and they're pretty to look at. And the seed is cheap and easy to start. So what happens with marigolds, for example, is once they get to the flower stage, thrips also like to feed on pollen, and marigolds produce a lot of pollen. So as you've got your marigolds in your garden, maybe in a separate little pot, you're checking them during your scouting and you're noticing, hey, there's some thrips damage in here. You can, at that point, start to either do some chemical applications if you need to have that level of control. Or with marigolds, oftentimes what we'll do is we will just continuously take the infested marigold out of the garden and put a new one in its place. So we are physically removing those thrips from the garden and trying to catch a new batch with the next marigold. And then we just continuously remove. And with that, we're decreasing our population. We're also keeping them away from our plants that we don't want to be affected. We've also got nasturtiums. These are heavily favored by aphids, which makes me sad because I love growing nasturtiums. I love their flowers, but they always look like crap because they're always full of aphids. But you know what? It's just the nasturtiums and it's not my other plants that are full of aphids. So that's a great one to grow. Bean plants are favored by two-spotted spider mites. And what's interesting about that is they start to show damage very quickly. So it could just be like 1 or 2 spider mites and you start to see the damage really early. Whereas if you didn't have this and you had something else that was affected by spider mites, you might not see any damage until their population had built up significantly and makes it harder to control. And then if you've got whitefly problems, eggplant are also highly attractive to whitefly. They will show up on the bottom of these leaves and they'll go after the eggplant over your other crops as well. Right, and other traps, other physical methods of control. There are, of course, the classic beer traps for slugs. Slugs love beer. I think it's that yeasty scent on the wind. They can just smell it and they go right in there. And how many of you have used a beer trap in the garden? Okay, you? All right, so I'll explain what it is. I mean, this is pretty easy to see here. We've got a cup, we've got our beer. We dig a little hole and put the cup so it is flush with the ground or close to the ground. We fill it with beer, we wait. Next day, you should see several slugs in there. They will smell it and they will zip right into there and they fall in and they drown. And that's the end of the slug. Unfortunately, there seems to be a never-ending supply of slugs, so you'll probably need to just keep doing this. This is a control strategy because they will go for this over your plants. They love that beer. Some other things are some traps with lures. Oftentimes with beetles, there are pheromone traps that you can buy. Sometimes you have to get these from the extension office because they can be very specific to your location for what beetles you're dealing with. like you might have seen some Japanese beetle pheromone traps out and about. I live in the quarantine zone for Japanese beetles, so I see them all the time. And then our UV lights for moths and other nocturnal insects. The UV lights are more of a monitoring strategy because you won't catch them in high enough numbers to really make an impact on the population, but it can tell you when you're going to start seeing caterpillars, because before you ever see caterpillars, you have the adult moth showing up. And if they're showing up in your UV trap, they're probably going to be laying eggs. So this is a good monitoring strategy. Right. And then also physical, mechanical, removing weeds and debris. And it's not just because we want our garden to look pretty. A weed is any plant in any undesirable location. So if you're thinking like, what do I consider a weed? If you don't want it there, it's a weed, and that's it. So what do we do? Some tips for this: remove weeds before they set seed, before they're ready to spray seeds everywhere, because that's the next generation of weeds that you'll have to deal with. And it's especially important when we're thinking about things like hairy bittercress or mouse ear cress, where we've got these seeds that if you just touch them, they explode everywhere. And that's the next generation right there. So try to get those weeds before you see them setting seed. As you're removing your weeds, inspect them for insect pests. Sometimes you'll see aphids on some of your weeds before you see them in your crop. So just, take a quick look, see if you see anything there. Keep plant foliage free from leaf litter or splash soil debris. So that can involve raking away leaf litter. That can involve, making sure you're cutting down any tall weeds or anything like that nearby. And then remove dead or dying plant material. An important component of disease control is that when we see diseased plant material, we remove it from the garden, because that dead or dying plant material is a source of new inoculum to potentially infest healthy leaf material or plant material. So we always want to remove anything that looks infected, anything that's already dead, anything that might be on the way to dying. Get it out of there. All right, and biological controls. This is the step before pesticides. So we're getting real serious now. If we've done all of those control, monitoring, cultural, sanitation steps, and we're still having problems, it's time to move on to potentially some more impactful things. And one of the big things that we can do is adding biological control agents, or BCAs, to our garden. And it's important to remember with BCAs that these are living insects or mites, and we have some examples here for you to look at soon, that prey on our pests that we're having in our garden. So of course we have to identify what pests we have first. We've already done that. Predatory mites and insects are then released into our garden as pest control, but to be as effective as possible, we want to release them when population levels are low, so before we have a huge infestation. And we also need to release them more than once. So with biological controls, this is not a one and done release. You can't just buy a pound of ladybugs, release them into your garden, and then you're good for the rest of the season. For one thing, ladybugs will feed on aphids, but they'll also fly away. They may not necessarily stick around to control everything in your garden all season long. So this is why we have to continue with our scouting and also continue with multiple releases. So as home gardeners, oftentimes you'll have to focus on a couple species of BCAs that are going to have the most impact in your garden. For you guys, it's going to be things like ladybugs for aphids. They're not great in the fact that they will fly away. So you do have to release them more than once, but they are very voracious aphid feeders. The ladybug, the adult ladybug, as well as the larva you see here, are super good at hunting and killing those ladybugs or the aphids. For thrips and fungus gnats, rove beetles, which we have a breeder box for here for you guys to take a look at, are great choices. I really like rove beetles because they do tend to stick around, and they're very easy to maintain in a breeder box situation. So you can keep a population around and release pieces of that population pretty continuously with a little bit of extra effort. And then for thrips and any of your mite problems, you can put out sachets of predatory mites. I'll explain what that is. But some predatory mites do prey on the mites that you're going to find in your garden. For example, here, this is a Persimolis mite, and it is feeding on a two-spotted spider mite. You can see one of the spots right here. These guys are super active little predator mites that you end up pouring them on top of your crop, and they will just crawl around and feed until there are no more two-spotted spider mites, or your environmental conditions change and they die, which is another issue. The environment in the garden isn't always the best for your beneficials, so Persimolis can make a very big difference. And the way you release these, there's a lot of different ways to release these, and the different insectaries have been coming up with different release technologies for years now. Sachets are very common. These, you hang them on a plant, and on the back side, there's a little opening that your predatory mites will crawl out of and up into your crop. Then we have things like our Aphidius wasps, where we have some examples here as well to look at. These are pretty strong flyers. They will seek out aphids, but for these, they come in a little bottle, and you kind of just open the bottle and let them fly out on their own. For sachets, for some people who are, growing larger canopy crops, they come in these long stretches of sachets that they can just stretch across the crop, and they act like little bug highways for your predators to kind of walk around and get off and search out their prey that way, and these are pretty effective. And then for a lot of our mites, they come in this kind of like bulk material that you sprinkle over the top that carries the very tiny mites right to the site of the pest infestation. And something that's really fun is that they do have drone delivery systems now. This is the Parabug, and this thing will fly over the top of a field out in, like this one was in California, but just large field production. They've got these cylinders that just kind of turn and turn and turn and sprinkle the carrier material and their predatory mites all over the top of the crop at a very consistent rate as it's flying. It's really cool to watch. All right, so biopesticides and biostimulants are a step down from conventional pesticides, and there's a lot more interest in this, so now there are a lot more products. Biopesticides are pesticides derived from natural materials such as animals, plants, bacteria, and certain minerals. So you may find pesticides that are either just totally made up of a culture of bacteria that you spray onto your crop, or made of a bacterial byproduct or a fermentation product. You'll also see things like silicates, like this is an Agsil, it's a potassium silicate that can be used to treat certain diseases. And these are typically approved for organic production, and oftentimes you're able to find versions of this that are available for the home grower at garden centers and things like that. Biostimulants are things that just support the plant health in general. They don't necessarily fight any specific disease or pest, but a healthy plant is better able to fight off pest issues. And these typically come from either a substance or microorganism that, when applied to seeds, plants, or on the root zone, stimulates natural processes to enhance plant health. So this can be things like mycorrhiza, which would support root growth. This is a type of fungus that we actually like to see and forms beneficial relationships with our plants. and things like humic acid that can help with nutrient uptake. All right, and finally, our last option, chemical controls. Conventional pesticides are a last resort. I have some examples up here for you so that you can just take a look at what labeling and instructions and containers look like. But conventional pesticides are pesticides that include ingredients that are not biological or antimicrobial in nature. And you'll see this a couple times when we're thinking about pesticides. If it has a label, the label is the law. Follow label guidelines exactly. I've had that drilled into my brain over the last 5 years. The label is the law. So when do you use conventional pesticides? When all of your previous control strategies have failed. So you've tried cultural, you've tried biological, you've tried removing things, all of those other strategies, and you still have a problem. When your pest population is out of control, so this means your pest population is built up to the point that your biological controls just won't be able to handle it. And you would also use conventional pesticides when any damage to crop is unacceptable. For home gardeners, this isn't likely to be an issue, but for many commercial gardeners or commercial growers, they have to produce perfect crops. So that would be why they might choose conventional pesticides earlier than you guys would. General use pesticides can be purchased at many garden centers, but there is a category of pesticide called restricted use pesticides that you need a license to apply. Good thing for you is you will not be able to buy restricted use pesticides on accident. But general use pesticides, if it's at a garden center, it's probably general use. If you want to look at your list of Oregon restricted use pesticides, I've included a link here. But also there is a category of pesticides that are approved for organic production, and they often have an OMRI listed label on it. So what is organic though? First of all, organic is a federally regulated term, and it refers to food and fiber products only. So if we're thinking about organic products, something can only be organic certified if it's food or fiber. That means a pesticide cannot be organic, but it can be approved for use in organic production, which is an interesting and sort of a fine distinction. But to help people out, we have boards, review boards like OMRI. So this is an independent review board that assures the suitability of products for certified organic production, handling, and processes. If you are thinking about using a pesticide and you want to know, does it fit the federal guidelines for organic production, you can go to their website, you can search up whatever pesticide you're thinking about using, and OMRI will give you either their organic certification, or it'll tell you, no, it's not approved, or yes, it is approved, or yes, it's approved conditionally. There's a lot of information on this website because there are some organic pesticides or organic certified for organic production pesticides, and they would not be considered conventional. All right, so if you are going to spray things, there are some best practices. Again, read the label. The label is the law. But if you're spraying anything, always spray a small test patch before spraying your entire garden. And I will try, and I think we've only got a couple more slides here. Always spray a small test patch before spraying your entire garden, because maybe that spray that you're using is not good for that crop. There are crop-specific incompatibilities that can occur, and you only want to damage a single crop or a single plant before you fry your entire garden. It's always best to do that test patch. Spray when temperatures will be below 85 degrees Fahrenheit, early in the morning, cloudy day, or in the evening, because spraying and leaving foliage wet can cause burning, regardless of incompatibilities. Just simply having that liquid on the leaves can lead to damage. You want to spray when the dry time is likely to be less than 2 hours, again, because of that potential for damage. And also, the longer the leaves are wet, the more likely you are to encourage disease spread. You want to check the weather for rain events. You don't want to spray and then have rain just wash everything off. And if you're mixing from concentrate, double check your mix rate math, because you don't want to spray something that's too concentrated on your plants. And then finally, perform jar tests to check for pesticide incompatibilities if you're mixing more than one. I would recommend only spraying one pesticide at a time if you have to spray a pesticide, because it just simplifies things. All right, so I have a list of additional resources here. I'll just flip through them really quickly. You guys can review these on your own time. Some of my pictures got moved. There's the OSU Master Gardener program. You can become a Master Gardener and find some information there. They also have a ton of free resources, either culture guides, growing guides, insect identification guides, all sorts of things for pretty much any issue that you might be facing. The Pacific Northwest management handbooks. These are great. We've got the insect management, the disease management, and the weed management handbook. I highly recommend taking a look at these. For these, I would go to them if you have a specific problem. Say that you know you have cucumber beetles in your garden. You can go and you can look up cucumber beetles, and it'll tell you a bunch of different stuff on what products to use, what crops might be more susceptible, things like that. But it does give info on all management strategies, not just organic strategies. Good general education though. There's the UC IPM program, which is the University of California's IPM program. They have a lot of free educational resources. Yes, it is California specific, but IPM is IPM. They might be talking about California specific organisms, but management strategies can be implemented anywhere, regardless of where you are. Okay, yeah, and some of my pictures are covering things up. Oh, all right, and then local garden centers. I have Portland Nursery here because they have also just so many resources that are free for you to look at and download on their website, portlandnursery.com. They've also got a podcast, and they have sort of some of their resources are curated lists of plants if you want like drought resistant plants, or if you want a certain type of pollinator garden, things like that. They have lists of species that you might include in gardens like that. Again, highly recommend it. Local distributors, these are people who will sell you things like pesticides or beneficial biological control agents, all of your beneficial insects. So you might have heard of Evergreen Grower Supply. There's OBC Northwest, GrowGen Tigard, and Griffin Greenhouse Supplies. So I would recommend, just giving their website a look. And then professional organizations. So this is more on the academic side. Professional organizations are really great networking tools, ways for you to either hear about new research as it comes out, hear about shows that you might want to go to, like, for example, Far West show in August this year. I think I recommend going to that. Or, just meeting other people who have similar interests as you. So I'm a member of the American Society for Horticultural Sciences, but there's also the American Society for Plant Biologists, the Oregon Hardy Plant Society, Native Plant Society of Oregon, and the Garden Club of America. Some of these have membership fees. Most of them have reduced fees for students. They're great resources, and they also usually have educational resources as well available to you. All right, and that's it. Thank you, guys. Do you have any questions? I know that kind of went on for a long time.